Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Highlights from this week's disastrous events include antibiotic resistance in relatively ancient diseases, the Ben Spoon Award being issued to a cancer council or essentially advocacy group for cancer, RFKrayKray gets sued over his decisions around vaccines, and the proof that vaccines are safe on a very large scale, much to the horror of anti-vaxxers. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with ancient diseases, typhus particularly, and how typhus is increasingly resistant to any kind of treatment. This is not good. Typhus or typhoid has been a plague for humanity basically since inception. We have always had to worry about it until eventually some smart bloke figured out, you know what? We can make a vaccine to this, and suddenly, typhoid was no longer a major issue. There are even, major historical characters from the USA, Typhoid Mary being a perfect example, who essentially had to live in quarantine because they were a carrier. But although most of the world has basically gotten it under control, there are parts of the world that still struggle to some extent. Parts of Nepal, Pakistan, and India particularly, mostly due to issues around sanitation. There are parts of these countries that still haven't, developed a wide-scale and highly effective waste management system. This is not to say they're not trying, it's just slow going. As a result of this, we have antibiotics for typhus or typhoid, but unfortunately those antibiotics only go so far and for so long before it gets resistance to it, and that's exactly what's happening. The gene sequencing from these countries has found that, exactly what's being concerned about with every other disease out there, in terms of bacteria, is happening with typhoid, and that's really not good. We are basically down to the last line of antibiotics that work for it, and even that's becoming a problem, let's say. So yes, this is not good. Really, really not good. And the best part of all, though, is you don't need antibiotics. If you use vaccines, you have a decent chance of not having to worry about a major infection. But rolling out vaccines for it is, well, not necessarily something everybody and everywhere has access to, which is where we find ourselves caught between a rock and a hard place. Do you treat infection on a wide scale because people don't have vaccines, or do you find a way to deploy vaccines on a wide scale? It's a catch-22. In news that's more disconcerting, we can go all the way to the UK, and we're not talking about the royal family, although they are disconcerting. No, instead, we're talking about what is also just as incestuous as the royal family. A baby born to 3 parents, in fact, 8 babies. This is not the more readily and easily recognized example of embryo donation or egg donation, which does happen. Rather, what we're talking about here is something even more bizarre, to be honest. What you have is somebody donating what is, for all intents and purposes, the egg, the ovum. This ovum then has essentially the major genetic parts of it taken out. This is the mitochondria and the DNA in many cases. They then replace this with the other parent's DNA and mitochondria, specifically the mitochondria from the mother, but that's a separate issue entirely. From this, they use the father's sperm to fertilize the egg, and voila, you have a 3-parent child. This is weird, although admittedly not as quite weird as the 2-father creating a baby via weird stem cell treatments, but still it is weird. While you don't necessarily need to remove the DNA in the actual nucleus of the egg, you can do that as well if this is a pure donation of a whole embryo. But in other cases, we're talking only about changing the mitochondria from what is there already, which in some families is disease, to that from the donor. It's important to know that this is not a hugely successful process. It's about a 33% success rate, with 8 out of the 22 women being successfully pregnant. It is important to note that not all the mitochondrial DNA was replaced using this method. The vast majority was in all the babies, but the actual percentage that was replaced is, it varies significantly, anywhere between 77% all the way up to about 98%. So we are talking about a fairly successful treatment, and certainly a treatment that does work. All of these babies were born above the threshold required to prevent disease, so it does achieve its intended purpose, but it is arguably a bizarre phenomena, and technically speaking there is some ethical issues around this, but none that should arguably prevent it from being utilised outside of the UK. The only issue with it is going to be the whole weird-ass inbreeding thing, which the UK is already quite okay with, given that their monarchy is as inbred as, well, an Alabama family. Next we move on to skin cancer, and this is both relevant now and it will come up again later in the video, but what we have is skin cancer and a treatment for it. But the treatment for it is not what you might think, like surgery or chemotherapy. Rather, they're going to attack it with a virus. This is not so awesome. It does work, but historically it's been a terrible idea. Giving women rabies to try and treat cervical cancer led to women with rabies, and a slightly longer lifespan, but still dying, whether from the rabies or the cervical cancer. But in this case, the herpes virus was used to attack cancer specifically. And, well, this is pretty damn good. Melanomas are, well, rather obviously skin cancers, but they affect the pigmentation cells in your skin. And so, the published research, not peer-reviewed but published, has found that, yeah, this does actually achieve what was hoped. It's important to note that it is a sort of clinical trial. They had 140 patients, and of these, a decent number ended up not having as significant cancerous growth. Now, this is a catch here. It doesn't stop the cancer, it doesn't remove the cancer, doesn't kill it entirely, but it does reduce it. And by reduce it, we're talking about shrinking it by about 30%, for up to 90% of the tumours that were tested. This is an important caveat because it doesn't necessarily remove the tumour, but it does mean that theoretically you could reduce the size enough that what is already an extremely invasive cancer could be made far less invasive and thereby, well, partly conserve tissue, but also if the tissue is, say, being invaded elsewhere, for example, the skin cancer has grown deeper into the body, well, this could help to minimize damage to other organs or structures in the body. So, yes, this works well, and being a herpes virus, it is relatively controllable, relatively being considerably, let's say, qualified there. So, this is not a new treatment, not in basic concepts anyway, but it is overall something that is new in the way they've used it. This, however, does mean that you have a slight problem. When you initially have the virus going into the tumour cell, what it does is the same thing that it always does.
Where are you going, Brain?
Back to the cage to plan for tomorrow night.
Why? What are we going to do tomorrow night?
The same thing we do every night, Pink.
It should, in theory, incorporate itself into the genome and make more virus copies that then get released and possibly kill the cell, or go dormant. It's one of two options. Tumour cells, given the way they work, they basically never turn off the DNA replication cycle, so the virus just keeps being replicated, and this is what leads to the death of the tumour via this particular herpes virus. So yes, this is especially useful in terms of being relatively effective, relatively controllable, and very effective in terms of being a minimally dangerous treatment. If it ever gets approved, which the pipeline from phase 1 and 2 trials to being released publicly and approved is very long, very expensive, and may not ever see the light of day. In terms of treatments that we have vaccines.
Ah, here we go again.
And we now have a study looking at aluminium in vaccines and how, for all intents and purposes, the claims that they cause autism is bullshit.
Feelings don't count in science.
Along with many other chronic diseases. They've basically taken the anti-vaxxer playbook of claims about vaccine safety in aluminium and gone, no, you're idiots. Here is all the evidence to show you not only why you are wrong, but why you are stupid. Which, they're anti-vaxxers, we don't need you to tell us they're stupid. It's sort of like vegans. They tell you they're stupid by telling you they're anti-vaxxers. The results are fairly straightforward. They've done a few things here that are a little more complicated, so This might take some time, a few minutes, so bear with us. What they've done is take all of the aluminium exposure from all the vaccines given during the first 2 years of life. That's important here. They've taken all of the cumulative doses of aluminium you've received from vaccines over 2 years of life. They've then looked at whether or not there was any increase or association with 50 disorders. Now these could be things like, say, autism, but there are a bunch of others, autoimmune disorders, for example. There's a bunch of these. We won't go through all of them, but just be aware that, they are fairly comprehensive in what they've done.
All right, little guy, time for your immunizations.
You, might want to hold him.
Hold me for what? What the deuce?
Oh, I'm sorry, sweetie.
Back off! Don't come any closer or I'll cut her.
The results of this show that no, there's no relationship. The only questions people tend to have, and these are some fairly important questions in terms of not quite knowing what's going on, is why did they use follow-up years and not actual cases and similar? And it boils down to how long individuals were followed up afterwards. So, for example, if somebody was only followed up for 10 years, that is basically from birth until they hit 10, well, that's a very different case than somebody who's followed up from, say, birth to 18 or a birth to 6 or 5. It's very important to notice those differences. Now, you might think, okay, well, this had to be a very small-scale study. It can't be that significant. No, this was a very large study. It involved over 1.2 million children in Denmark, born between 1997 and 2018. This is another reason why they used follow-up years and not actual years, because, well, someone born in 2018 would only have been followed up for 2 years, whereas someone born in 1997 would have been followed for significantly more time. And so we can say, no, there is no relationship. There's no conflict of interest in funding. There is nothing here that should, and this is the issue, indicate any relationship between aluminium and vaccines and any other issues.
Vaccines cause autism?
Well, I have 1 million results that say they don't, and 1 result that says they do.
I knew it.
Just because I have it doesn't mean it's true!
Now, the anti-vaxxers are probably going to move the goalposts way, way, way further back, because that is what they do. If they can't make their initial claims satisfied, they simply make a new claim and say, no, that's what was meant all this time. You've just misunderstood, because they can make an entire industry out of the gas they produce from gaslighting people. In terms of other metals that could have an effect on your brain, we have copper. But importantly, it's copper in how it can help your brain, not make it worse. But primarily here we're talking about copper in your brain with old age. Now we're going to sound incredibly racist, xenophobic, whatever you wish to call it, but it's Chinese research and we are somewhat skeptical about Chinese research. There have been some fairly major scandals with regards to this, and not just the CRISPR babies or the HIV babies, but rather a range of other issues. So first of all, we're talking about the Hebei Medical University in China, and now we're looking at US adults, so this is where things get kind of funky. But they're looking at about 2,400 adults aged over 60. What they were trying to establish is, if you have more copper in your diet, does your brain work better? This is largely correlative and not necessarily causative research too. So now we have 2 reasons to be skeptical that their findings are not necessarily true. They may be entirely true, but they may not be reflecting the actual thing causing it, which is a very important distinction. If you increase copper, and it's really not the copper you're increasing through your diet, but something else in your diet, for example, just eating more diverse food that makes you better cognitively, you're sort of following a red herring. It's a false positive. But their findings are, well, if you have a roughly, increase of 1.22 milligrams per day, you can see that there is a benefit in terms of improving your cognitive function. Now, this is not all of the study, but we're not going to try and get into the nitty-gritty details to save on time. These videos tend to drag on anyway. But yes, the causative and correlation are not necessarily there, but they've certainly established a model to chase up afterwards, which may prove more useful later on. In sort of related news, we have energy drinks. This sort of content is why we will probably never get a sponsorship from G Fuel or similar. that energy drinks are apparently increasing cancer rates. Well, sort of. There's this big scary idea out there that energy drinks are terrible for you, because they're bad. And most of the justification is going to be things like a high fructose corn syrup, the taurine, and so on. The problem with a lot of this is, no, the research really doesn't support that. And the reason it doesn't support that is the primary active ingredients of any real significance inside an energy drink are going to be caffeine and sugar. And the caffeine levels are largely on par with what you get from a cup of coffee anyway. The sugar levels, however, now that is where things are a worry. But we'll ignore that for now. Let's go to the actual research, which, as we said, there's a claim, but the claim has a huge catch. The taurine element that we mentioned, the sort of marketing flair ingredient, is really just an amino acid, and it's found in a lot of meat and fish products. This is what has, let's say, attracted attention particularly, and why the research is saying technically it does, but it's the same way that saying technically being in an emergency room is bad for you, and not the bullet in you.
Coincidence? I think not!
You can see how there's a significant gap between the cause and effect there. This is what brings us to the research. The taurine could be contributing to the progression of leukemia. Could be being the key word here. And it's based largely on rodent and then later human leukemia cell samples. What they found with these cell samples is that taurine has a major role to play in their development. So you would think, okay, this is fairly straightforward. You find the thing, it's a smoking gun.
Coincidence? I think not!
Not quite so fast. True, there's a larger presence, let's say, but most people still consume a fair amount of taurine every day regardless of whether or not they eat energy drinks or consume energy drinks, or not. It's really not that important. Most days you're going to consume anywhere between 40 and 400 milligrams of taurine, so there's a good chance that you're not actually exceeding your daily recommended intake with energy drinks anyway, assuming you're not consuming them at an unreasonable amount. That is the key here. Unreasonable amount. Theoretically, and this is the catch, you may find that you increase risk of certain leukemias and other cancers, or for some cancers there's evidence taurine helps to prevent them. Yeah, nothing is clear with this. So that means there's a theoretical option, let's say, that yes, consuming it excessively, it could lead to some cancer, but also help you with other cancer that's different. You just can't win. And this is why I would argue, as always, that a life basically has one objective. It's trying to kill humanity. It's not very effective all the time, but sometimes we manage to help it along the way. And next we have what is helping humanity kill itself, obesity, and a solution to it. But we already have a solution. It's called diet and exercise. Or you can take up our advice from another video and deliberately become obese so that you can then be buried and sequester the carbon from the atmosphere, thereby stopping global warming, or at least slowing it down. We're going to get in trouble for that someday, we're sure. But the video is there. It's somewhat satirical, but it's certainly worth a laugh. So we have to ask, what is the, reason we bring this up? And it has to do with the UK, again. The government has commissioned an independent report called the National Food Strategy, and what they say is, essentially, we're spending so much money because people are fat, overweight and obese, that we're actually going to go bankrupt, or at least hugely economically disadvantaged because of it. And this makes sense. Being obese or overweight does significantly increase your risk factor, if not directly causes, all manner of comorbidities on top of just being fat.
Well, in Whoville they say that the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day.
Now, for example, hypertension. Hypertension is just increased blood pressure, but above a certain threshold and sustained. And for sustained blood pressure, that then increases risks of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, aneurysm, etc. So you can see how one condition suddenly cascades into all of these others, and it works quite well, sort of. And so, theoretically, targeting just one thing suddenly prevents all these other cascading events, to some extent. Now, this brings us to the solution. It's, well, exactly what we said at the start. Eat less, do more exercise. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same thing a lot of people say. Calories in greater than calories out equals weight gain. So, just increase calories out or decrease calories in, if not both. It's easy. And unfortunately, there's the whole, what was it? It's the South Park thing. Rich people get Ozempic, poor people get body positivity. That is to say that they're told, yeah, you're fat, but you should be happy in your fat body. No. It's going to cause you all sorts of medical complications. Get over your shit show of wanting to be accepted for who you are, because who you are will kill you. Again, this is something we're going to get in trouble for eventually.
It's delayed.
Oh no! Anyway, last week...
Secondary to that is, well, stigma. But stigma is somewhat necessary. You want to encourage people, even if only gently, via social influence, peer pressure, there's got to be some appropriate word for this, to shift from being overweight and therefore unhealthy to a more healthy lifestyle and weight. Everything we've mentioned so far does come with a couple of fairly big caveats. Things like, say, food deserts, which are not just unique to the USA, it's true in many countries where access to reasonable food at a reasonable price is basically non-existent unless you go a very long way, and that may not be possible. So you basically sustain yourself on calorie-rich and very nutritiously poor food, thereby increasing the risk of obesity. The simple summary of eat less, move more, although true, doesn't necessarily address everything, particularly, say, if you have mobility issues, if there are certain, let's say, genetic problems, medical conditions such as thyroidism, and so on. So there are some caveats to that. But this isn't to say that it shouldn't be a major element of any treatment, and for very good reason. But the conversation article does pose a somewhat contrary point of view to this. In other health-related news, we have a possible justification for why the solution to being ill has always been some sort of soup. Now, whether it's a chicken soup, some sort of noodle-based soup or dumpling soup, in Japan, say a rice porridge, all these sorts of things that are relatively easy on the stomach, but typically fairly fluid-rich, are actually helping you to some extent. It's based on a systematic review, so there is some flaws with it, but of these flaws, we would say that the biggest ones are that it really does boil down to a very small subset of actual good quality studies. So out of 10,000 possible sources of information they found for this, there were just enough studies, 4 in total, that had roughly 340 people in total to demonstrate why soup could help you. Yeah, it's not exactly ideal, and the actual impact on your recovery is probably minimal, given how little it does, but it does provide justification for why this is suggested. So let's say that you take this at face value and say, okay, the study is not that great in size, but it is a fairly comprehensive analysis of the literature. What are you going to get? You get about 2.5 days better recovery time. That's it. But you do also, to a certain extent, get extra nutrients that are going to help you in that recovery. You could possibly target some of the inflammatory markers that helps to alleviate the symptoms and so on. So it isn't all doom and gloom. There's also the fact that, well, you are effectively, because you're eating a soup, you're typically going to be at home and generally recovering, or, depending on where you are in the world, possibly some sort of, let's say, anime household where your best friend looks after you in their place, leading to all sorts of shenanigans. We'll ignore that issue for now. So, yes, there is a strong case to be made that soup is helpful, but that strong claim has a fairly major caveat. Going on now to other food-related news, but sort of food security? We have a canned salmon and a rather horrifying surprise. Canned salmon is sort of useful, as it will be preserved for a very long time. But it also, because it preserves for a very long time, provided a weird insight into the state of health of salmon going back decades. And we mean that quite literally. what we have here is a parasite found in the salmon inside a tin or canned salmon. And that's not great, partly because, well, it tells us that the salmon are somewhat infected, but it does provide an opportunity for parasite ecologists and epidemiologists, marine biologists and so on, to look into what's going on and kind of think, what the hell? The, let's say, marine biologists involved in this research were given access to really, really old samples from quality control methods. That is, they basically stored these cans and said, we need to keep them for a time to make sure that everything is all good. But, having received them, they're looking at this and going, well, we found these parasitic worms, admittedly parasitic worms that do no harm to humans, but are present in salmon, and they're going, yay, this is a good sign, because these weird parasitic worms only survive if the ecosystem in which the salmon or fish is growing are actually healthy ecosystems. So they look utterly disgusting and unappetizing, but they also show that everything is working as it should be in the environment in which the fish were farmed, caught, or otherwise managed to be obtained. If you want the, let's say, most useful information out of this, and somewhat the most disconcerting, depending on your access to salmon and particular preference, the pink and chum salmon had an increase in these parasitic worms over time, whereas the other options, that being the sockeye and coho salmon species, did not. So, yeah, if you are eating these, just be aware that you've increasingly been consuming parasitic worms by a fair margin. You could, if you are particularly disconcerted by that news, shift over to consuming lab-grown salmon, which should be completely free of parasitic worms, unless somebody has screwed up spectacularly, in which case you probably have other worries, given that you're probably not consuming lab-grown salmon in the first place. The entire process is essentially the same thing as what was done with, say, meatless chicken and beef. That is, they take cells, typically wild cells taken from cultivated salmon, and they grow them up in a laboratory, and they then combine these in a similar process to how McDonald's makes food, that is, by essentially mushing together things that vaguely resemble meat, ice cream, or whatever else it is, and then say, this is edible. Except in this case it's actually protein, or at least protein that should be from the original animal, in this case, salmon muscle. The, let's call it a bizarre choice, is not just, well, bizarre. It has actually been, let's say, consumed in particular ways, and intended to be so. For example, consumed like a sashimi is prepared. We're probably doing that a very great disservice by describing it that way, but let's make it easy. There's also, let's say, other reasons to do this. The second is that there should be no bones present. It's obviously ethically farmed because it's not actually farmed, it's grown in a petri plate or cell culture dish. And of course, you can be fairly confident in the safety of the food and the lack of parasitic worms. Again, unless something has gone terribly and completely wrong. So we would refer you to the article in question just to get a better idea of what's happening here, but it's kind of cool. And next in environmental news, we have fig trees. But fig trees in Africa that can create rocks by carbon, which isn't that surprising. A lot of rocks should be, if not mostly, made of carbon, unless they say gold nuggets, in which case they are made from gold, obviously. But these fig trees are instead taking extra CO2 from the air and turning into limestone within their trunks. And this could be useful, again, very sort of optimistically, by being able to, say, grow these trees and convert the obvious atmospheric CO2 into a usable, practically available, or at least somewhat easily sequestered stone. Very much similar to how, say, a coral works. It takes CO2 that's been dissolved in water and converts it into its structure, largely speaking here about the outside part of the coral, not the living part. This is one way that could be used in, say, forestry in order to improve conditions, but of course it does raise sort of secondary issues around, well, growing the species somewhere other than parts of Africa. The key thing here is that Although promising, it is a very limited use and a very, let's say, specific solution. In food-related news now, and food-related entirely, we have the demonstration of how America is supposed to work.
Sirs, another insurance company is going under.
Now determining most prudent move for insurance company.
People have been screaming how Trump is doing this, that, and the other and destroying the country. And you could make an argument both ways. But one of the most, let's say, frequent is, oh, he's cut funding to this, that, or the other service. The caveat to that is very simple. There is a three-part government in America. You have the executive in the form of the president, you have the legislature, that is essentially the elected members of government, and you also have the judiciary. For the most part, this is basically SCOTUS. But technically speaking, lower down you go, the other courts can achieve something similar. In this case, we have a perfect demonstration of how these three powers can balance each other out. The Senate has rejected Trump's proposal to cut agricultural research funding, which is exactly what they're supposed to do if there is an issue with this. And this is very good in terms of the USDA, as that allows for, well, obviously, the funding to continue, which is really, really important if you want to maintain food security. The funding for this isn't just going to affect food security, but how food can be adapted to changing environmental conditions, how we can better grow the food that we have now, and so on. And a lot of this money is not just going to be used by the USDA, it is going to trickle down to universities and research institutes trying to do exactly this. Now, the plan was to cut funding, but with the way the Senate has approached this, it's basically going to remain stationary or stagnant through 2026, roughly $1.7 billion, which isn't an insignificant amount of money, but this is important for two reasons. First, because it shows, despite the outcry, that the way the American government is set up is working the way it's meant to work. The second side to this is, well, funding will continue and America will continue to grow in terms of what it can do. In, let's say, purely environmental news now, although one that will come back to haunt various people, mushrooms that have been found that can consume fungi and help to some extent with the current issue around plastics. Not just plastics in, say, bottles, but to a lesser extent, microplastics. And possibly be the next horror movie wherein Kim Kardashian and the other members of the Kardashian family are chased through a forest by a giant mushroom. And not that kind of giant mushroom, but still.
Hello?
I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna slice you up.
Who is this?
I'm gonna chop you like liver.
What do you want?
I'm in the house. Do you know where I am?
What we have is the fungi breaking down plastics, and this is particularly useful, as mentioned, purely because they are something of an issue. If you look at the volume of waste caught in the ocean, there are basically a handful of companies that are responsible for the vast majority of it, and this eventually leads into, well, there being a huge amount of their bottles sitting in parts of the ocean, or one part being known as essentially a trash can. What the fungi do to deal with these after they've eventually figured out that, hey, this might actually be useful, is take peroxidases and hydrolases and break down the polymers that make up plastic. Now, this turns the plastic into smaller, more manageable bits, and these can then be used by the fungi as nutrients. This may also possibly allow for the, let's say, filtration and removal of microplastics, at least from water, which would be great news for those who think consuming water from glass is better. Apparently, it's not. There is an important limitation to all of this, though, and it is very, very simple. The fungi are temperamental. They require certain conditions to grow and do anything, really. And if you don't have those conditions, they will not survive. This means that it is a very niche and specific way to solve the problem of plastic in the world. It's not a bad solution, but it is a very niche solution. Shifting to news that's still somewhat environmental, we have a bizarre phenomena, a ball lightning caught on camera. Wait, now we've seen this before, and that's definitely not ball lightning. Fairly sure we're about to see a naked guy who's very well turned step out of that and proceed to go on something of a killing spree. Well, possibly not. This is Canada. They might go on a very polite spree. Rare Phenomena was rather obviously caught on camera in Canada, and although it's only a 23-second film and we're not going to play it because the copyright is an absolute bitch at times like this, it's caught the world's attention. The weird phenomena looks, well, weird, and has arguably been the source of historical things around, say, will-o'-the-wisps and ghosts. But it is literally just a lightning. Or it could be ghosts, who knows? Well, no, actually, we do know. Going now from environmental news in terms of weird phenomena to weird designs and France, but also still the environment. It's bladeless wind turbines. No, this isn't just a giant Dyson fan, this is actually a wind turbine of sorts, although France appears to have developed some sort of penchant for putting giant dildo-like structures across their countryside. It's possibly a fuck you to Germany after World War II, the same way they put a giant nuclear power plant on the border with Belgium. Shifting now, no, we'll actually go into this. The creepy technology has been built in France, at least that we're aware of, although the actual company is Spanish, and this is Europe in a nutshell. The downside to these strange structures, other than like giant penises being dotted across the countryside, is that they are less efficient than conventional turbines. Not necessarily badly so, given that you can theoretically fit a lot more in a much smaller area, but they do, to an extent, provide a significantly lower threshold of energy. How much less does vary somewhat. The exact numbers vary from as little as 20% of the same energy all the way up to 80%. The upside to them, so to say, is that they do require significantly less maintenance because you don't have giant blades spinning in the sky that get worn out and have to be replaced. They are silent. They are bird-friendly because they aren't killing birds trying to fly through the blades. And to an extent, they are safer and easier to install. The upsides to the technology as it is now is that they are mostly made from the same parts as larger turbines that use blades. They are compatible in exactly the same way, and although the, let's say, conditions required to operate them are similar, and the conversion method is similar, it's not exactly the same, which, at least that's some benefit. But overall, we find the choice of making these and implementing them kind of bizarre. Not bad, just bizarre, which is probably the slogan Europe should embrace. Going now to news that's more academic, and academic purely in the sense that it's all about a retraction. We have Nature retracting an article that was published in 2022 claiming that there were new kinds of brain cells. This retraction has not been, let's say, done cooperatively by the authors. They've instead done it very much against their wishes. The reason it's being withdrawn is for a very simple reason. Analysis of the data by other parties has basically found that we don't think what you found is actually what you found. This is not necessarily new, and it's one reason why we've been inherently somewhat, let's say, hesitant about some news topics, for example, the room temperature superconductor from Korea. But if you look at all of this, it's pretty much the same usual thing, which is you have a researcher who's found something, they've been overzealous in what they've found, and they've then tried to demonstrate this on a larger scale, and
that's hot. That's hot.
After looking at the data, they may have been a little inconsistent. The reason we describe it as overzealous and inconsistent is that the evidence they're relying on is mostly more consistent with contamination rather than actual what you're intending to find, which isn't something that should ever really happen. There are plenty of ways, reliable ways, cheap ways, easy ways to check whether or not you have contamination of your samples, so that shouldn't be happening. The problem we have is sort of threefold with this whole debacle. First of all, the evidence in question has been challenged in another publication, which is really how scholarly research should work. You find your thing, someone else tries to replicate it and finds that, no, we found this, or we haven't found what you found at all, and publishes their research and then typically writes some sort of commentary, letter to the editor, etc. on top of their research. You then go back and you possibly do your research again or try and reproof it another way and show, well, no, this is what we've actually found. But nature has, weirdly enough, been overly zealous this time in a retraction, which is ironic given their history of not retracting things they should, and decided, no, we're going to take it off anyway, which is really kind of dumb. So we have a weird contrary practice to what should happen, the lack of scientific debate over it, because they've also refused to publish the second bit of research showing that they've actually found what they think they've found using another method, and finally that, well, it's kind of not really at the point where you should be retracting it, but at the same time, you could arguably say that there are methods available still to pursue this and see whether or not the editorial practices of nature, well, they're not best practices, they haven't been following them forever, but in this instance, whether or not they are at least trying to follow them. Shifting to other news that's not academic, but shows a failure to follow best practices, we have Australia, and specifically the Cancer Council of West Australia being given an award called the Bent Spoon. This is an award given by the Australian skeptics, essentially to show that you've done something related to quackery. In this case, it's an endorsement of the pseudo-medical and scientific practices of Reiki and reflexology. The problem we have with what they have done, and seemingly the same sort of issue the skeptics of Australia have, is that Reiki and reflexology by themselves aren't really going to cause any harm. You might feel a bit of pain in your foot, but that's it. Reiki basically has zero contact and it might make you feel good in a very ephemeral sense and not the kind where you get a happy ending. Well, you might, but that's not part of reflexology. Instead, a lot of the groups that provide things like Reiki, reflexology, and so on are more of a pathway into cancer diagnoses being completely ignored or treated improperly. Now, for example, if you get cancer, you might go off and you'll be getting chemotherapy, you might have to have surgery, radiation, etc. All of these things are done that directly address the cancerous problem. Well, cancerous problem in terms of cancer and not these pseudoscientific practices. But if you go to these other groups, you might be told, oh no, Reiki can heal you. And, well, Reiki costs a lot less than all the things around oncology do. So you eventually wind up going to the Reiki practitioner and getting treated that way and not via oncology, which means you don't get treated at all. Of course, it might just be that they are complementary, in which case the oncology treatment continues along its way and you get all the benefits of actually being treated, while the Reiki practitioner can say, look, I made you better, I treated your cancer, when they did shit. So this is why the Cancer Council of West Australia has been given their Bent Spoon Award. They've literally been promoting a nonsensical treatment that will provide no benefit, nothing of any use, in the hopes that people will somehow do so. And finally, we have the last news item for you, which is more pure politics, although somewhat hilarious politics, in that RFKrayKray is being sued over his vaccine policy.
Can we sue?
Out the butt.
Yeah, we should sue.
This is not the first time that RFKrayKray has been sued, but some medical organizations, in fact some of the major medical organizations in the USA, have been suing the health secretary because he's an idiot.
Coincidence? I think not!
And an anti-vaxxer.
Vaccines cause autism?
Well, I have 1 million results that say they don't, and 1 result that says they do.
I knew it.
Just because I have it doesn't mean it's true!
And incredibly hypocritical.
Why the fuck you lying?
But the issue here is very simple. We have, first of all, that he's been trying to claim that COVID-19 vaccines pose an imminent health threat. They don't. In fact, they do the exact opposite. They are one of the major ways to reduce the severity and spread of COVID-19. Just the same way influenza vaccines work. Just the same way MMR. Just the same way any one of the many, many other vaccines you will receive over your lifetime help.
Feelings don't count in science.
But he's basically arguing that, no, the vaccines are bad, they're not proved, there's nothing to... No, they're not. We're not going to retread this ground again and again and again. In short, RFKrayKray is just that. He is crazy, He's an absolute hypocrite, and he makes shit up because he can. If nothing else, his Making America Healthy Again report proves that he basically goes to ChatGPT and says, write me a document that says this is the conclusion, but justify it. And then ChatGPT or whatever other particular LLM he's using makes up bullshit to fulfill his crazy fantasy.
Ah, oh, that's hot. That's hot.
The justification for the lawsuit is fairly straightforward. RFKrayKray is trying to dismantle the long-standing, congressionally authorized science and evidence-based vaccine infrastructure that has prevented the deaths of untold millions of Americans. This is true. RFKrayKray has, on the other hand, effectively claimed, sometimes through his mouthpiece Children's Health Defense, that, say, the death of 2 children in Samoa was directly linked to vaccines.
Ah, here we go again.
It wasn't, or as RFKrayKray himself explicitly claimed, that the CDC had been hiding evidence that the MMR vaccine or some other vaccine was somehow leading to an increase in autism rates.
Coincidence? I think not!
Again, that's not what it found, not what it said. He's full of shit. So no, there is a good reason why this lawsuit is not necessarily going to win, as we very strongly suspect the lawsuit will be stopped once it's very clearly established that what he is doing is nonsense and he will lose. But that does mean we will never get a, let's say, court-based decision proving that he is full of shit, which is sad because we would love to see the not just investigation into his background and activities, but all of the discovery documents that go into what he has done and been up to. Because knowing about his investment in various groups, his time with various groups, and his various claims and knowledge about what those groups are doing would be incredibly interesting. Sadly, we probably will never get that. And this case will probably go nowhere after the initial, let's say, hearings, establishment of a time frame, and so on. Which, again, unfortunate. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, put them below.